In 2016, I traveled with the International Justice Mission to the Dominican Republic to learn about the horrors and challenges of human trafficking. It was a group of pastors and ministry leaders, and we were sent to observe and pray and to open our eyes and hearts to those who were in need. And we waited till after dark each day and then walked the streets of Punta Cana, learning about the sometimes subtle and sometimes overt signs of injustice. Our focus was narrow. It was girls aged 9 through 15 who were being trafficked to much older men. And the first time we walked down the main street, we were instructed to simply act as tourists, buy ice cream, buy souvenirs, sit in an outside cafe, drink a soda, just act normal. And this was to sort of orient ourselves to the main street, to see where things were, to not be gawking and looking. And when we got to the end of the main street, we were told to turn around the corner, walk down behind, and go down the street again. And what was revealed on the second walk down the street was more than 12 sightings of the very behavior we came to learn about, of human trafficking of minors. And I won't go into any details, but we were trained to see odd age differences, fearful postures, vapid eyes, trapped children. And as we quietly wrestled with what was right before our eyes, we walked silently back to our bus, partially awakened to injustice, partially angry at a God that would allow it. 6 of us had daughters between the ages of 9 and 15. And as we made our way back on the bus, the director of the agency pointed outside the window of the bus at an instance of human trafficking happening right in front of us by a lampstand in the town square. Not on a hidden back street, not in an alley, but right out in the open. And as we watched through the windows what was happening right before our eyes, we heard noises coming from the other side of the bus. We heard singing coming through the windows on the other side of the bus, and we looked over to the other side to see about 25 churchgoers bounding down the steps of their local church, clutching their Bibles in hand, laughing and singing joyfully to whatever gospel good news they had just heard. The injustice of human trafficking on one side, and the joyful voices of Christians on the other, and a bus full of observers to witness it all. We were trapped in the in-between, keenly aware that we were more likely to identify with the churchgoers who were oblivious and afraid to intervene than to help those who were in great need. In the book of Job, chapter 38, God says to Job, "Were you there in the beginning when I laid out the entire earth? Were you there when I stretched a measuring line across the earth?" And the words of Job point to the holy plumb line, the center, the measuring stick, the guidebook for how we ought to treat each other. I remember the first time I saw this sort of device. It wasn't quite a plumb line with hanging weights, but my father would take a red chalk line and hold it on either ends of whatever project he was working on. With a quick snap, there was a red line across the center of what we were doing. And from that center line, we could measure where we needed to build, where we needed to change, whether we were in the right place. That night in the Dominican Republic, I witnessed a church that lost sight of the plumb line. So focused, albeit innocently, on being church that they were no longer able to see the injustice that was right outside their door. And if there was sort of like a freeze frame on that moment, and these prophets that we hear today could sort of travel between eras, Micah and Isaiah would be surrounding these Bible-clutching churchgoers and trumpet their prophetic call, saying, "Wake up, people of God. There is injustice right in front of you. Wake up and free those oppressed children from slavery." And both of these Old Testament prophets, Micah and Isaiah, were living in lands filled with injustice. They were contemporaries, and their messages are similar. And Isaiah was sort of the more well-known prophet that we hear often. And Isaiah lived in the city in Jerusalem, and he was angry that there was so much injustice in the city, so much disparity between the wealthy and the poor right in the city. And Micah lived a little bit farther outside of the city in the rural areas. And Micah was prophesying against all these rural farm workers that he lived with who would go to work for the rich folks and come home and still live in poverty. And so these two prophets both lived in the face of injustice every day. And they spoke to the people of God, and their message is so harsh. There's no sugarcoating it. Micah even sets up an argument in a courtroom saying that each and every one of us is on trial. And God is the prosecuting attorney. And God calls the mountains and the hills and the trees as the witnesses, and he looks right at the guilty and he says, we've seen it all. We've seen it when you've judged, when you've hoarded, when you've treated anyone with less dignity or worth. And with the indignation of a generous parent, God looks at his people and says, how dare you? After all that I have done for you, I have rescued you from Egypt. I gave you manna in the desert. I've given you weddings and babies and friendships and clothes and houses and jobs. And most of all, I have given you my love and affection. And God says in Job 38, I have set the plumb line for the standards of the world. I set it before you were born. I gave you this whole world to enjoy, so how could you look the other way when one of my children, one of your siblings, was in pain? And as much as I wanted to look the other way, it was impossible to do so last year when I traveled to the Equal Justice Institute in Alabama. This museum was set up by the organization founded by lawyer Bryan Stevenson, author of Just Mercy. And the museum walked the participants through the journey of the slave, beginning with a rocky boat passage through turbulent waters. And after you step off the theoretical boat, you stand face to face with life-size prison cells, where the slaves who were brought off the ships were held. And the cells were inhabited with life-size holograms that moved and responded as you got close. They had mannerisms and facial features. And as I neared one slave woman, she sang out hymns, the same hymns I sing, Amazing Grace and Standing on the Promises of God. She was my sister in Christ. But as I moved on, the last cell on the left had holograms of two young boys clutching each other, yelling, Mama, where are you, Mama? And I couldn't look away because I felt like if I moved on past them, that I was abandoning them just as they had been abandoned generations ago. And there was a bench nearby, and I just sat and listened to the cries of these boys coming from every corner. We are so far from the plumb line. When there is an interrogation, either in a courtroom or in a marriage or in an elementary school classroom, the person on offense says, did you do it? And the person on the stand has the opportunity to do one of three things: to tell the truth, to lie, or to point the finger. And Micah shows us what it looks like to tell the truth. And when God says, did you do it? He falls to the ground and humbles himself for the Lord, confessing his pride and his selfishness and his sin, saying, how am I even worthy to approach you? How can I face you? He doesn't say exactly what he's confessing, but he says that the people of God have done too little about the injustice of the world. It's a question that each one of us must ask, a question that each one of us must wrestle with. What have we done about the injustices of the world? And I think many of us struggle to figure out who's at fault. We love someone to blame, somewhere to point the finger, because it takes the light off our own wrongdoings and it eases our guilt. Do we blame the policymakers or the slaveholders? I'm not in government. I never owned a plantation. Do we blame the rich? If so, what's the cutoff? Is it 50,000 or is it 1 million? Do we blame the children who were orphaned or abandoned? Do we blame the mother who had to flee because she couldn't stand another night of abuse? Do we blame the grandmother that I met in the Dominican Republic who brought her granddaughter to the traffickers because she needed money to pay for the 10 children in her home who were without food? We spend the majority of our time looking for the ones to blame. When God isn't asking for blame, he's asking for ownership. He's asking us to take a look at the standard of goodness and love that he has set for us and asking us to recenter our lives on the ways of Jesus. But as Pastor Tim Keller says, if we do not identify with the poor and oppressed, if we do not have a relationship with the poor and oppressed, if we have moved so far from God's standard that we are no longer able to hear the cries of pain, then we do not have a relationship with God. Because Jesus himself was poor and oppressed. The poor and oppressed matter more to God than those who are living comfortably. And I know it sounds really harsh, but it's the same as a teacher with 30 students in the classroom. Some will get it easy and some will struggle, and she must spend less time with the ones who get it easily and more time with the ones who struggle. And lucky for us, in the courtroom drama of Micah, God doesn't banish him or send him in the darkest layers of hell. No, he gives him a 3-part plan. And as people who love a plan, I think we should be thrilled that the consequences of apathy to injustice have not yet been enforced. And as Micah says, number 1, do justice. Don't just believe in justice. Don't think it's a nice idea, but do it. Lift up the poor, help the oppressed, label no one unworthy, see no one as other. Number 2, love kindness. Love being kind more than you love being right. Love being kind more than you love your stuff. Love being kind so that other people get the benefit of the doubt every time, even if it makes you look like a fool. Sign me up for the Fools for Christ program. I'm all in. And number 3, walk humbly with God. I try to imagine what it would look like if God and I were sort of holding hands, walking through life. I would treat people a lot differently if I really believed that he was right there with me, looking at everyone with grace and love and mercy. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. But it will never work. It will never stick if we see it as a duty. Isaiah chapter 58 says, if you see my Sabbath as a delight, if you find joy in this work, it will be beautiful to you. And Harvard professor Elaine Scarry says the only way that justice will work is if we find beauty instead of duty. Because duty is still self-absorbed. It's still about us and what we've done or not done. But beauty decenters us. It takes us out of the middle of the world, and it once again recenters what God has created. Duty bogs us down, but beauty inspires us. And Isaiah shows us this beauty, what the world could be with the work of justice. And he says, if you stop pointing the finger and stop speaking evil and start to pay attention to the needs of the afflicted, then you will be called the restorers of the bridge and the repairers of the world. We have all come face to face with injustice at one time or another. And this weekend, we honor the life of a man who chose to see the injustice and not look the other way. We see a man who saw God's center plumb line, who saw a guiding force that welcomed all people, loved all people, and he was willing to sacrifice anything to make sure that everyone felt God's love. And so, friends, as we go from this place, may we be people who are about the restoration of God's beauty for the world, people who connect and love and give and serve and recenter our lives around what God has put in place.